Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be invited by Datuk Sri Lim Chong Kiat to join this Bellevue Culture Club event to pay tribute to his great friend, R. Buckminster Fuller, who's an American architect, system theorist, designer, inventor, futurist, author of more than 30 books. And of course, this is the 125th year of his birth. I have to confess that even though I'm vaguely aware that Bucky, whom I hope you don't mind, I shall call him as a mark of respect, was the designer of the geodesic dome that is housed in Komta. I'm only a simple accountant and a former central banker, so I had not read his books until very recently. And of course, Datuk Sri Chongket was very good to give me a copy of his book Critical Path. And only when I began to read and think through what he has written, Bucky has written, that I realized that he harks back to the great thinkers of classical Greece, India, and China, who thought in cosmic integrated system terms. And of course, most of us mere mortals are worried about the next email and urgent task and don't have time to think through like that. Now, he did this because he had a wide range of personal experience, having tried his hand at everything from craftsman, inventor, architect, to big thinker. I personally come from the island of Borneo, from Sabah, where I went to Sabah College, where Tunku Aziz was my teacher and who's present today. And I narrowly followed the conventional path of every dutiful Malaysian son who sought to become a doctor, but I was not bright enough to do that. I couldn't even become an architect or engineer, and I decided to become an accountant. So as an accountant, we can't foresee the future, and this subject is all about future. It's very difficult to predict because the present is a mess. How big that mess is, let me give you a few facts. We're going through the worst pandemic since the 1918 Spanish flu, with more than 10.5 million infected and more than 500,000 deaths, of which half the numbers are in Americas. Sorry, 1/4 is in Americas. And the WHO has warned that the pandemic is not over. If anything, the rate of infection around the world is accelerating. We have the worst sudden stop depression since the 1930s, with more than 44 million unemployed in the United States alone. And the drop in GDP is anywhere between 5 to 14% this year. And it will take us at least 2 years to find the vaccine and get back to even some form of normality. Strangely enough, the stock market is at record high, or at least after the greatest monetary printing in history. We are now 5% off the peak, and I would not be surprised if we exceed the peak before the end of the year, although we could crash just as much. Interest rates have never been as low, and there are over $10 trillion of bonds that give negative yield. The governments around the world are spending $10 trillion in fiscal spending and cumulatively may spend up to $30 trillion. That's over 1/3 of global GDP, the highest size of government debt since the wartime borrowing. World income and wealth inequality is the greatest ever. and which is causing huge protests around the world. Poverty is increasing because of the pandemic. The last 5 years have been the hottest on record, with locusts, flooding, rising sea levels, famine, and loss of biodiversity. We have politics that are very toxic at local and global levels, with nuclear powers almost at blows with each other. And of course, we have the most stable genius running the world or dismantling the old order through tweets. So you only begin to realize Bucky's genius, restless creativity, and original perspective when you start reading his works, which began in 1927. He was an inventor at 12, machinist, Harvard education, extensive experience as mechanic, meat packer, naval radio operator, boat captain, entrepreneur, and then Greenwich Village intellectual. He lectured at Black Mountain College, inventing the geodesic dome there. And from there, he emerged as the polymath Renaissance man with many followers around the world. Now, as I can claim only to have read only 3 of his books, I can only testify to my very shallow understanding of the evolution of his thought and its impact around the world, and particularly on me. But he has this unique ability to piece very complex, very detailed factors and facts into a comprehensive whole, systemic whole, with a cosmic view of life. And opening one's mind is a hallmark of a great thinker and teacher. In his book, for example, The Operating Manual for Spaceship in 1968, he expressed in shattering insight what took me until 2009 to realize my own fault, which is that the reason why we are in this mess is because we are all trained as specialists. To quote, "Our failures are a consequence of many factors, but possibly one of the most important is the fact that society operates on the theory that specialization is the key to success, not realizing that specialization precludes comprehensive thinking." And of course, all universities have been progressively organized forever in over finer specialization. Society assumes that specialization is natural, inevitable, and desirable. The result is, of course, that we have been taught to learn more and more about less and less, and have forgotten as children to see things as a whole. The result is that the world is divided into silos of specialists, all of whom are think they're experts, they are absolutely right, without realizing that they're all frogs in a well who think that the light above is the world. So Bucky is the polymath who's able to weave together history, power politics, mathematics, climate change, energy, and nature together. It was his naval experience that enabled him to see that maritime power was how Britain and America dominated the world previously occupied by continental land-based powers. And of course, America is today dominating space as well as cyberspace. And this is part of the situation that we're in. Now, as an architect, he had a spatial view of everything, being able to look from the mountaintop and yet appreciate the finer details of the landscape and how one could change it through technology. So, because he was an inventor, he actually is what I call a technocratic technology optimist, that knowledge and technology will solve our world, and he found the critical path towards that nirvana or solution. Now, of course, but the reality, of course, is that we live today with Malthusian limits to planetary growth, and technology can change the game, but we are producing more and more with less, and we can produce more and more with less and less, but we're actually not. We're consuming more and more by printing more money and debt. And the reason why we can indulge in excess consumption is because we can print debt infinitely. And when we consume Mother Nature, climate change is the revenge of nature, as it were. So his image of Spaceship Earth is a 20th century perspective that we must all live in the same boat and we must take care of it as an integrally designed machine that must be comprehended and serviced as a whole. Now, if I may, with all due respect, critique this a little bit, I don't think the use of the word machine is the right way to think about it. It's not linear, it's not mechanical. The Earth is a living organism. And we should have all the humility to realize that we are part of that living organism, and at most we are stewards of Mother Earth and humanity, not its masters and slave owner, and that we can spend as long as we carry the right credit card. Now, Bucky, of course, is correct that we should apply general system theory to Spaceship Earth. The father of Chinese rocket science, Chen Xuesen, used the model of open giant complex systems to describe every individual human beings, because our brain contains 10 to the power of 12 neurons. So we, as an individual, is already an open, complex giant system. And every day we're interacting with different human beings, with Mother Nature. So the Mother Nature is a planet undergoing a big bang in a universe that is, there are multiverses of all living and physical things. So, this cosmic perspective cuts our intellectual capacity to size, and we must have the humility to recognize that we are only specks in the sands of time. Now, Bucky has full of insights with wondrous quotes about how we should get out of all this. So, for example, he had this prescient view that we must, quote, make risk-free bailouts of private enterprises. For those of us who are bankers today, we'll see exactly what's happening. The Fed is printing lots of money to bail out some zombie companies. Now, it was in the Spaceship Earth book that he brought in the idea of a geoscope to enable human beings to understand the patterns of human activity. And he uses the world game as an exercise to simulate the true planetary cost of everything. So, today we can use models to predict the path of pandemic infection and mortality. In his book, The Critical Path, he had a vision of a path or process to save humanity from the existential dilemma of either blowing ourselves up with nuclear war or suffer planetary disaster. So he, was one of the first who actually pieced everything together to find the critical path forward. And he realized that he needs to do this through education, realizing the mistakes of energy and resource wasting behavior, and moving away from artifacts to things in changing in mindsets. He is the great thinker that forces us to move out of the physical world to the metaphysical. I actually found his last book, The Grunge of Giants, 1983, most useful to me personally, because he pulled together all these complex and comprehensive thoughts into one cohesive narrative. In his foreword, he put the alternative paths as either atom bomb extinction or crowding ourselves off the planet. I think this is a very good way of posing the problem, simple but dramatic. And his choice is to quote, technologically transforming the environment instead of trying to politically reform the people. And I think that's also extremely realistic, but also, in my view, very idealistic, because human beings are always dominated by politics. Now, Bucky's great strength was that he spent last 30, 60 years of his life to create the vocabulary and also invent the artifacts that fitted his vision of how humanity would change and should change. And he's, influenced many, many people, including the people around here and around the world. And many of his artifacts have become reality. For example, his idea that, you should have generational charts of global trends and transformations is today can be found in visualcapitalist.com. And how he interpreted the journey of man through land, on foot, land, and then ships, and now airplanes, and then through cyberspace, is visionary, is truly visionary. He had this statement such as, "I see one minuscule computer chip completely altering the whole world scene." And today that's beginning to happen in the same way one virus has changed the world. So he saw very clearly that humanity is now experiencing history's most difficult evolutionary transformation, that we are on our ever swifter way to becoming an omni-integrated, majorly literate, unified Spaceship Earth society. For example, he foresaw in this book that network masses today are being bought and, quote, controlled by a minority, since a US presidency costs $50 million, a senatorship costs $10 million, and a representative seat $5 million. Observed that the TV era governments are corrupt, wherefore they, the people, abhor and abstain from further voting. And those of us who are in Malaysia who see seats being bought and sold, that resonates. He saw three powerful obstacles to realization of humanity's omni-physical success. First, the technological means of its accomplishment through what he calls the invisible realms of technology, which is basically not everybody understands technology. Secondly, experts are too narrowly specialized to integrate and carry out the omni and integrated execution of that vision. Thirdly, they cannot comprehend and apply the new methods of metabolic accounting, dwelling, self-employing, and cooperating and enjoying life. I think he's correct, but how to make this a reality, to remove these barriers, is very complicated. Now, I should explain what he meant by grunge, which stands for Gross Universe Cash Heist, meaning the invisible global corporations and elite who run the world, which evolved, as he put it, out of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, which are in bracket, in the quotes, corporately interlocked owners of a vast invisible empire, which includes airwaves and satellites, plus a vast visible empire of clustered cities that control the financial credit system and mass production and distribution ventures. In that sense, if you look at the visual capitalist networks, you would realize a few hubs control all these complex networks. Now, to be fair, I must confess that I'm perhaps too ignorant and too unable to completely grasp the complex and powerful vision of this intellectual giant like Bucky. Because the world has become too complex, and like entropy, it is evolving in its everyday complexity. We are now using big data and artificial intelligence to try and reduce this to some kind of sophistication. But Bucky is absolutely correct. He thinks that there are two tools, what he calls solo developed craft tools and the multi-human involvement tools he calls industrial tools. And these tools, of course, are today artificial intelligence and big data and huge models. So in sum, let me say that, I think Bucky is visionary. He has actually laid out a path using technology to get out of our quandary. He understood, to quote, planetary economics has now shifted from a physical and land and metals capitalism to a strictly metaphysical, omni-planet, omni-cosmic wealth know-how capitalism. And of course, personally, I'm against all isms because ideology is not the, is part of the problem, not a solution. He thinks that it is for a substantial majority of humanity, and eventually all humanity, realistically to comprehend the falsity of the greater part of the inventory of academic premises and axioms upon which the thus misconditioned reflexing of educated society is based. That, in my view, is a very tall order. The diagnosis is correct, but it will be easier to change the Catholic Church than it is to change the economics profession, let alone politicians. Now, his conclusion as to whether humanity will do so within the critical time and environmental development limits is that it will remain cosmically undecided up to the last second of the option's effective actuation, knowing that beyond that imminent moment lies only the swift extinction of humans on planet Earth. What he's basically saying is that Cassandras, you can talk all you like, human beings will not change until the last minute. And some of us think it may not change. So there is no doubt in my mind that we must pay homage and tribute to Bucky, because where we are today has been made possible by standing on the shoulders of giants like him, who have thought the unthinkable and give us ways to avoid the unavoidable. We have indeed arrived at a moment of truth in the midst of this pandemic. Whether we are able to get out of the greed of grunge of giants and move to the ideal path remains an existential question. Now, many of us are pessimistic. The baby boomer generation created the greatest wealth and created also the greatest debt, leaving the mess for the next generation to resolve. So whether we can get out of it would depend very much upon the young, and whether we can persuade the young to understand that they must make their own mistakes, but they can learn from the past and learn from great thinkers like Bucky. So the beautiful part about it is that the young do not have the same fears and the mental blinkers that we have, but they don't have the integrated roadmap that Bucky has laid out for all of us. So you can see Greta Thunberg, speaking out truths, daring to challenge the establishment and shame everybody over climate change. But it is one thing to protest, another thing to govern. As Genghis Khan was advised, you can conquer the world on horseback, but you can't rule from horseback. Destruction is always easier than construction, and the toughest part of mental construction is a vision that can be implemented with the consensus of the people. So let me end by talking a little bit about the themes of today's Culture Club talk, which is about local, national, and global perspectives. The reality is that all politics are local. Hence, we are today interlinked by technology into a global world, but unfortunately, we live in a 1948 Treaty of Westphalia of national sovereignty, struggling to manage global problems without global public goods. As Mr. Trump shifts America back to its isolationist stance, withdraws back to its inner thinking, which is completely understandable. FDR had to persuade America to move out of its protectionism into engagement into the Second World War, which created American world leadership, but also sucked America into the global problems for which they are trying to decouple. So if Bucky is correct, the grunge of giants is still alive and kicking, if not fully in control, and there are many signs that they are pushing America into blundering, if not by intention, but by accident, into World War III. Now that's a very pessimistic scenario, but whether we can get out of this grunge trap will depend upon the elections of November, in which hopefully the American people will select the leader that will take them out of their own swamp. Now, since our own politics in this country is not much better, I am not that hopeful that we will perform much better. The only consideration is that the choice of leaders in America are all over 70 years old, but still younger than our 90-year-old seventh Prime Minister. So I appreciate very much the wondrous powers of imagination and future telling by Bucky. But being a student of Chinese history and philosophy and trained very much in the West, I have come to appreciate that there is today a convergence between the reflexive nature of ancient Chinese thinking, such as the I Ching and Tao Te Ching, with the complex uncertainty and relativity of Einstein and quantum physics. We need to have an omnicultural lens to understand and eventually cope with an omni-complex world. The problems of the 21st century lie in us wearing very much lie in us wearing 19th century glasses that cannot see the black swans and the grunge of giants right before our own eyes. The lessons of history, as the philosopher Santayana reflected, is that we seldom learn from history. To some extent, every generation will have to learn its own mistakes. It is my personal regret that I have not read Bucky until very recently, and also that the Trumps of this world are not correcting our mistakes, but adding to them. Perhaps we all have to go through purgatory before dawn comes back again. So let me end with a Bucky quote. "We are called to be architects of the future, but not its victims." I think he is absolutely right. Let us go on this journey with a hopeful heart. To conclude, I want to congratulate and thank Datuk Sri Lim Chong Kiat for allowing me to join this occasion, and I apologize I cannot join you in physically, but only in virtually. I hope you all have a great discussion on the important issues of our time. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.